Good morning, everyone. I think we will try and make a start so that we can get away on time this morning. We do have a rather large topic to discuss today, and I think it'll be interesting and varied and a wonderful panel. A little bit about our forums. We've been holding these for close to 2 years now, a bit over a year and a half to 2 years. And what we're trying to do is build a network of interested people who will contribute to the conversation as much as they will hopefully get something out of the conversation. So today we're here to discuss a huge topic, particularly in the light of the Edward Snowden affair. We've assembled a pretty impressive panel for you, I think. So I'll start off with Stephen Dunkley, who's in the chair closest to me. Stephen's had a varied career, both as a CIO, COO, covering all sorts of areas of responsibility, looking after large numbers of staff. And he recently told me a couple of other interesting facts in that he'd also worked for Halliburton in Iraq and had a prior career serving in the Australian military and may have had some intelligence expertise there as well. So hopefully we'll draw some questions out about that as well. Heather comes to us from a legal background, originating in Canada, then working with Gilbert and Tobin out here, and before joining Macquarie Telecom as their general counsel, and has since moved into an executive role looking after their international voice and data. So I think she'll bring both the legal angle and hopefully a bit of the telecoms angle to this, and there certainly is a massive telecoms angle on this. And Jeffrey, I've asked as our sort of media advisor, and what happens when it all goes wrong, when it all hits the fan, what happens in these sort of situations, because I think a lot of this has to do with brand, has to do with how the media handles data leaks. What do we do as business leaders to ensure that the message comes out appropriately and that the individual people are protected? So without going into too much further on that, I think we should probably kick off on the big media message that's come out of late. And really, the Snowden affair is probably not as surprising as people might have thought. The idea that people might be able to tap into your email or tap into your phone conversations has been around for quite some time. And coming from a law firm background, the idea of actually using email in the 1990s was very much not going to happen. It was considered as bad as sending your client a postcard. Why would we put confidential information into an email and send it off to our client when anyone could read it? Now, we seem as a global community to have lowered our ideas on confidentiality and security for the convenience of modern technology. And I think that is something that we're still grappling with, and as new technologies come out, we're going to continue to grapple with. For those who aren't totally aware of what PRISM is and what's happened with Edward Snowden, I thought I'd just borrow some slides from the US government. And this is what they used to explain how PRISM works. So PRISM started back in about 5 or 6 years ago. The idea being that much of the world's information was actually flowing through US service providers. So all of your email, a lot of your video, a lot of your voice, all of that could be tracked by going through US service providers, and this gave them access to a wonderful resource of data to pick up. So looking at what and who they were talking to, they decided that they could pick up email, chat, video, voice, stored data, photos, all sorts of things, anything from your online social networking, the stuff you're sending your girlfriend or boyfriend at university, and so on. And most of these providers were from America. So why couldn't they tap into it? Over a very short period of time, most of those providers agreed to provide. So back at the very beginning, Microsoft in 2007, Yahoo quickly after that, Google, Facebook, YouTube, Skype, AOL very quickly followed. So they're gathering massive amounts of data, and this is what Snowden found to be, that he felt had to be exposed. Not only were they gaining information about their own citizens, but also about foreign governments, and in particular Snowden's theory seems to be that he can continue to embarrass the US government by slowly leaking their data out, showing how much of this has been going on. Lastly, Apple joined in 2012. I don't know why they held back. Maybe it's something to do with Steve Jobs. But a very interesting program. So I guess to sort of start with the panel, I mean, what have we got in Edward Snowden? Maybe I'll kick off with Stephen. Do we think he's a whistleblower or a traitor?
It's a very interesting question. I think most of the whistleblowers that have maintained their credibility over time have done so on the basis of an ethical framework within which they've worked. And I'm failing to see an ethical framework or foundation supporting what Snowden's done. And without getting into the detail, the three examples that I would draw on to have a look, and there's Daniel Ellsberg, who many of you may remember as the person who so-called leaked the Pentagon Papers, which revealed the lies and the mistruths and the illegal actions of the United States government and many other things around their involvement in the Vietnam War. Ultimately, he wasn't prosecuted, but he got legal advice. He saw journalists with the basis of legal advice, and he worked through congressmen and senators because of the moral issues that he found in working on this report that he participated in under McNamara's direction at the time, that revealed a whole lot of information that many of the politicians were lying about. But he worked from within the United States. He worked on the basis of legal advice, and he worked through elected representatives. Ultimately, the case was thrown out of court when he was charged on a technicality. So while he was never acquitted, the government didn't have a case to proceed with. And Snowden may well have been in the same situation. If he felt morally outraged about what was happening, what action did he take to work through his organisation? Closer to home, Andrew Wilkie, who's now an independent member of federal parliament, was working in the Office of National Assessments, which is a peak body that sits over all of the intelligence agencies, not to direct them, but to write assessments on the information and the intelligence that they have. And he reached a position where he believed that the evidence that was being relied on about the Australian government commitment to go into the war in Iraq was flawed. And he reported up through the chain of command and wrote reports that ultimately went to the government and the security committees and whatever, but were ignored or were deliberately, there were deliberate omissions in some. And so through an ethical foundation and framework, he worked to bring that information into the public, but he didn't do it by sneaking off somewhere to a third shore, foreign shore, where he sought their protection to reveal the information. Peter Fox, the police superintendent, who broke ranks in the New South Wales Police Force to reveal information, also exhausted all of the channels. And if you look at the protections that we can provide for whistleblowers, there's a whole raft of legislation, both in the Commonwealth and in each of the states, about disclosing information where it's in the public interest, or you find evidence of malfeasance or maladministration or corruption. There's a framework and a way to do it, and you've got to be prepared to stand up and take the consequences. So I don't, in this context, I think he falls into the context of a traitor rather than a whistleblower, because he didn't seem to have the moral courage or the personal courage to work through an ethical framework in revealing the way he revealed the information.
Thank you.
Actually, just on that point, I guess you're drawing a parallel between here and the US. Maybe just like Assange doesn't want to go to Sweden because he's concerned about going to the US. There may be cultural differences between here and the US in terms of what the consequences may be for actually going through a whistleblowing process in such a sensitive area in the US versus here. So maybe he felt the need to actually leave the country to actually be able to blow the whistle.
That's possible, but if you look at all the Sarbanes-Oxley legislation that the US Congress and Senate themselves put in place to ensure that there is a level of responsibility for grappling with the truth in organisations and exposing corruption and exposing illegal acts. There are a lot of protections within the US legal framework that will provide protections. Ultimately, he has to make the judgment. He may have felt that. Maybe he didn't get good advice beforehand.
Is there a difference between corporate whistleblowing versus military Secret Service whistleblowing?
Potentially. However, the Ellsberg before him worked within that framework before there was a lot of that type of legislation and protections in place, and ultimately succeeded. And I don't think the ground has shifted that much, even with all the so-called hysteria around the consequences of 9/11.
Thank you, Stephen. Heather, I was going to ask you about, could this happen in Australia? And I prepared my questions before seeing the Saturday Herald about the FBI having access to Telstra records for, I think, the last 10 years, so it's been going on a bit longer. What sort of protections do we have in Australia, and where do the mutual legal assistance treaties sort of fall into play?
Well, first of all, we've got our Australian privacy principles. That's a starting point when you look at the protection of data. Normally that applies more in terms of personally identifiable data rather than corporate data and corporate information. So if you move into the realm of corporate data, you're then looking at common law duties to protect that data, duties to your employer, the circumstances in which you received that data, and whether the circumstances dictated an obligation to keep that data confidential. Often covered in things like employment agreements, but even if it's not expressly covered, in the circumstances when you receive that information, did you know that you ought to have treated it confidentially? And then if the information is leaked, the question becomes what's the damages that flow from that breach? Was there a loss? Is there a damage to reputation? And so on and so forth. From a mutual legal assistance treaties perspective, if the US government approached the Australian government on assistance, there needs to be a linkage to some sort of criminal act. It's normally in terms of collecting evidence, and the kinds of examples that I've seen it used is more around money laundering and the US government approaching the Australian government for bank records to see if the proceeds of crime are being kept here. Drug trafficking is another example that I've seen, and child pornography, I think, unfortunately, is another example. They tend to be quite extreme examples. I'm not familiar with any examples of terrorism, but obviously a lot of these things are subject to gag orders, and we may never know about it. But I think one of the distinctions between Australia and the US, and I promise not to turn this into a Patriot Act discussion, but I think in the US, the Patriot Act provides, and that was of course after the events in 9/11 and perhaps rightly enacted, provides the US government with the ability to get information without court judicial oversight and without the issue of warrants. So they can use national security letters to get what are effectively administrative subpoenas, which have a much lower judicial threshold to get that information. And of course companies like Google and the rest of them, they've all admitted that they're subject to the Patriot Act. And in cases that I've seen, they'll quite readily give information to the FBI because, it's one of these sorts of things where it's going to be expensive to defend in the courts, and, geez, it's the FBI knocking on our door. In Australia, we don't have the equivalent of the Patriot Act, so I would suggest the mutual legal assistance treaty is a different threshold. It's government-to-government cooperation. Now, outside all of that, as you saw in the news with Telstra and the FBI, I think the contract's been leaked through Cracky if anyone wants to read it. The contract that I'll need to be careful coming from a quiet telephone not to comment overly on Telstra, but there was a contract which I've seen and read. It was 2001 between Telstra and the FBI and the Department of Justice, and anyone can read it. There's contractual arrangements that can, of course, happen outside of the legal process in terms of whether the MLAT applies or not. If a company in Australia has agreed to share that information with the government, then it's agreed to do so.
And do the public need to know that?
Well, I think this debate's an interesting one, because at the one hand you've got the legal obligations, and I would say for Snowden, the legal obligation to abide by his employment terms, and within the strict bounds of the law, I think you'd have to say that there was an act of treason. That's my personal view, the view of my company. I'm a lawyer, so I'll continue to explain my comments. On the other hand, we have to look at why he did that, and he did that, I think, because there's a public interest angle here. And certainly the EFF would say that that people have a right to know what the US government's doing, and he's done a great thing, he's actually a hero. In the strict bounds of the law, you can have moral issues against legal issues all the time. Is an act of euthanasia the right thing, but the law says otherwise, right? So I think it's one of those classic examples of it's still an act of treason, whether it was in the public interest to know about it or not.
And I think that sort of comes back to what you're saying, Stephen. If you follow the right pathways and the right ways of doing things, you're not likely to be subject to being treated as a traitor in the same way as you might if you skip the country and then start releasing data.
Sounds like you'll be less likely to be prosecuted successfully as opposed to being treated as a traitor. It sounds like no matter what happened, Ellsberg and others always being treated that way post the event, whether or not they've been prosecuted successfully.
You think so? Yeah. Interesting. Jeffrey, what can the US government do to save face here? I mean, this is a huge media storm as much as it is anything else.
It is a huge media storm. I think that's what's really driving their embarrassment, clearly. The bottom line is the thing they need most of all is for this to get out of the news cycle, for it to stop being a news story, for people to move on and focus on something else. That's not going to happen, certainly not while Mr. Snowden is in his limbo, until we get the next stage of where he ends up. There's always going to be speculation, there's always going to be an angle to run that. But listening particularly to Stephen and Heather, it is such a complex legal minefield and moral minefield here. And I think that to me, the thing I've hit me about Snowden is it's really changed the game. It's a massive game changer. It's no longer about how do you keep your data secret, how do you protect that data, because in the age of the internet there are no secrets anymore. For me, it's now about how do you manage the inevitable leaks. And if we look at what the US government's done, it's quite interesting. And Heather, I probably would need some support on this one, but my understanding is he's been charged, or discussion's been charged under the Espionage Act. And from what I understand, that act doesn't apply to him. So you'd think that the government would be getting some pretty good advice on whether that was the appropriate act. Why would they then have chosen this act? Because it brands him as a traitor, as a turncoat. It labels what he's done and puts that in context. Whether they are ultimately successful under that legislation is less important than what are the public thinking and feeling. The other thing that's interesting about what the government's done is that the main statement from Barack Obama was an absolute headline grabber, and he's the expert in that space. He said something like, it's not like we're going to scramble fighter jets to bring him back. Some very powerful line like that. That cut through, that was reported all around the world. I spent a while thinking about why would you say that? For a start, it's negative. He's saying what he's not going to do. And when I was thinking, well, what else could he say? When you're making statements, you want a clear one that you choose to be picked up and heard. That was the most exciting thing he said in that press conference. So he didn't discuss what he'd done. He didn't discuss his ethics. He didn't discuss ramifications. He didn't discuss what was actually happening. He drew the media's attention like a kid with a bowl of candy to a brilliant line about scrambling fighter jets, and at the same time sort of showing he was a bit perhaps more relaxed about how the whole process would unfold.
Is the focus on Snowden a good distraction for the US government from their misdeeds in spying on their allies and on their own people?
Well, sadly I think, and I'm assuming I can go off the back there, sadly I think that it is a good distraction. And I think that what we're seeing now with the way media are working, journalists are under so much pressure to churn stories out. We're doing 3 or 4 times as much as we used to. We've got online, we've got print, we've got broadcast, and we've got all sorts of other things happening. We don't have the time and effort to pursue stories in detail. So we take the path of least resistance, the sexiest angles. And it's coming down to the fact that the public are so easily distracted too. Our attention spans are limited. Yes, this is a huge story, but it's enough for us at the moment to be distracted with this. So it's a very clever use of the angle playing the man rather than the actual ball.
Right.
I think there's still quite a bit of publicity around the US side. I think it depends on what you read. I think this is more mainstream, like, oh, guy on the run, where's he going to end up? It's all got all the hallmarks of a movie that we'll watch in a couple of years, no doubt. But I think that from what's happening to these, there's all the freedom fighters and the privacy rights activists, the Electronic Frontiers Foundation. If you go on any of their websites, it's all outraged. So I think it's probably a bit of a less mainstream front page. It's not the guy on the run story, but it's. I think we'll see, and certainly the quirky journals that I tend to read, and what the legal community is saying, there's certainly a lot of coverage on it.
And do you think the other governments are sort of shying away from it because they're probably doing something similar themselves?
I plead the fifth and say yes.
Before we move on,
only assume that they are.
well, I think we can assume that they are. Anyone in the group here today have some questions for the panel on Snowden?
It's more of a comment. I find it amazing that people find that this is actually happening when it's obvious that you've got information flying through a public infrastructure that everybody has access to. You don't have control over where that information goes. It just eventually ends up coming to where you want it to go. Governments certainly are aware of that, so that's why they've got protocols to ensure that you've got encryption, to actually ensure that if you go through that mechanism, it's encrypted from point A to point B.
Yep.
But, I mean, for anybody to say, oh, well, this is a big surprise, I just find it
Yeah, are we really
ridiculous.
shocked?
And I think that's the reason why
Yeah.
you don't actually have governments saying, oh, how dare you spy on me? Because everybody knows if you put it through the public infrastructure, that's your problem. You're an idiot.
Yeah.
I don't know how else to say it. Like, what does the panel think?
I think you're right. I mean, there is a certain amount of confected outrage in certain outlets, but individuals themselves are putting that information out there on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on a whole range of outlets. So they're exposing themselves in that context. I think the other thing that hasn't yet, been explored very much, but it's at the heart of what we're talking about here today, is that it doesn't matter how many physical or other technical barriers you put up to protect information. At the end of the process, it always comes down to the behaviour of individuals and trust. And whether you're working in intelligence agencies, in military intelligence, in industrial and commercial situations, it comes down to trusting individuals to do the right thing with the information, which mostly works. And therefore, the focus is probably ought to be on how do we ensure that we have people behaving in the way that we expect them to behave? How do we get them to live up to that obligation of trust? And I'm sure it will come up about the marginal cost of every dollar invested in physical security barriers versus managing people and their trust. I think is a really is a big question.
So I have to comment from a telecommunications industry perspective. I think, one of these things that we hate is we don't want these sorts of stories and these sorts of to sort of I guess make people lose confidence in technology and using the cloud so I think from an industry perspective, certainly Macquarie Telecom is pushing for some sort of industry code. I mean, we saw the bill for the data breach notification come out, and then there's the other things that the government started by. But I think that certainly we're supportive of the data breach notification. No company wants to be the only one to lead the charge and go every time there's a breach we're going to be telling everybody, because all of a sudden Macquarie Telecom is the only company that's ever experienced a breach when everyone else is perhaps sweeping it under the carpet. So the challenge we face is getting either an industry code that everyone's going to adhere to, which has a similar threshold and a framework, versus or legislation that says, in fact, this is what you have to do. Because we want that sort of transparency, because we want end users and consumers to be comfortable using technology. And part of the way to, I guess, win that battle is to say, look, if there is a leak, we will tell you about it. You will absolutely know about it, and you'll know what we're going to do about it to fix it. So I think the data breach notification, I think originally maybe when this was booked, that bill was still looking like it might have gone ahead.
It might have gone ahead then,
so
yeah.
completely prepared to talk about that. But that's okay.
Well, I actually had a question for Jeffrey on the data breach notification on if a company does decide to voluntarily announce that they've had a data breach, what does that do in the media, and how does it affect the individuals whose data may have been breached? Is it better for the company to keep it quiet and look after their customers?
And that's the question that I'm always being asked in various different formats. should we come clean? Should we confess? Is basically the question you're asking there. And I think the answer is yes. Earlier I said in the age of the internet there are no secrets, which is a big and dramatic statement, but it's true. If you have had a data breach, somebody will find out. If you've got, how many employees have Corey told me? 500. Do any of them have a smartphone? Probably all of them. Yeah. That's straight away, there's 500 sources of that information getting out.
Yeah.
Plus all your customers. Plus the outrage industry, we call them. I know you're talking about the confected outrage. Yes, and that's a legitimate effort as well. So there are people out there looking for opportunities to bring you down. If you have had a data breach, you won't be able to keep it secret. If you have had a data breach and tried to keep it secret, you're suddenly a bad person. That makes you in the wrong. So I guess it depends where the data breach came from. That needs to be looked at, whether it was your fault or not your fault. But the bottom line is, tell the truth. Tell it early, tell it often, come clean and be judged. Because you're only going to make it worse by trying to suppress it.
Yeah.